Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the only independent in the House, let me raise a few issues which I consider to be terribly important, but which unfortunately don't get discussed all that much here in the House chambers. For a start, I think maybe the most important issue as a country that we have to wrestle with is to what degree is the United States of America today a vital democracy? Sounds like an easy question. You know, we have the right to vote. But really, to what degree are our people involved in the political process? To what degree do people have faith and expectations of the political process? Mr. Speaker, I would remind you that just 4 years ago when in 1994, when Mr. Gingrich and his friends took over the House of Representatives, we had an election in which 38% of the people voted. 62% of the American people did not vote. And in that election and today, we continue to have by far the lowest voter turnout of any industrialized nation on earth. Why is that? And why don't we discuss this issue? Why is it that millions of low-income people no longer participate in the political process, no longer believe that this Congress deals with issues or makes decisions which are relevant to their lives? Why is it that young people in leaps and bounds no longer pay attention to what goes on politically and don't believe that the political process is relevant to their lives? We don't talk about that issue, and I think it's important that we do. And I think the answer is twofold. First of all, I think there is a great deal of discontent with the two major political parties, and I think that millions of Americans think that both political parties end up representing the wealthy and the powerful. And second of all, even deeper than that, I think there is a growing belief that real power does not lie within the political process, that it almost doesn't matter who gets elected, which party controls Congress or state legislatures, but real power rests elsewhere. I know in my state of Vermont and throughout this country, we see large corporations saying, well, we would like to pay less in taxes within our city or within the state, and if you don't give us a tax break, we're going to move to another state, or more likely we're going to move out of the United States of America. And what does a mayor or a governor do, or a legislature do under that scenario? It doesn't matter what the legislature, what party controls the legislature. Essentially what people understand is that real power rests with the people who have the money, and if the people who have the money are not pleased, not get the tax breaks that they want, they're going to move elsewhere. And when that happens, people say, well, why should I vote for you or for you? It doesn't really make any difference. You really don't have the power. So I would argue that this country faces a major political crisis. During the 1960s, the Beatles were talking about what happens if they started a war and nobody came, nobody fought in the war. My theory is that the day is going to come, we're going to give an election, and people are going to not come out to vote. In 1994, we had 38% of the people voting in the national congressional elections. Last year, when President Clinton was reelected, I believe we had about 49% of the people voting. My guess is that the next national congressional elections in 1998, we got about 35% of the people voting. And the voter turnout will go down and down. And it is up to this institution, the United States Congress, to stand up and to try to understand what's going on and figure out a way that we can reinvigorate democracy. We talk a lot about education. Everybody agrees, conservatives, progressives, the importance of education. But if we are not talking about education for a democracy, the right of people to control their own future, what are we talking about? The second issue I briefly want to touch on is the issue of the booming economy. Mr. Speaker, you can't open a newspaper without hearing about how fantastic the economy is doing. Some of our Wall Street friends say, my God, it's never been so good. We can't imagine it getting any better. And yet, when you look at the fine print, which appears on page 68, somewhere beneath the sports section, you find that the real wages last year for the American worker was up 3.8% when inflation was about 3%. And if you know that the low-wage workers got a boost because of raising the minimum wage, and the upper-income workers generally do better, what you conclude is your average middle-class worker continued to see a decline, a drop in his or her real wages. The economy is booming, but the average American worker continues to get you very much.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Lampson of Texas. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to express my dismay over the continued mishandling of the disaster relief bill by the Republican leadership. I represent a district along the Gulf Coast, and perhaps in several months after a devastating hurricane, I'll find myself in the same position as my colleagues, Mr. Pomeroy and Mr. Thune. I know that I would want disaster relief for my constituents in Galveston or Port Arthur or Texas City or Beaumont to be delivered as quickly as possible. Instead, my friends from the Dakotas have watched with what I can only imagine to be a combination of anger and disgust as certain factions within this body have played politics and political games with their aid. I voted against adjourning for the Memorial Day recess so we could resolve this situation. I cannot imagine how my colleagues must have felt returning to sites of the flood devastation and trying to explain the holdup. And yet, with great empathy for flood victims, I felt that I had no choice but to vote against the disaster relief bill when it finally came to the floor. The practice of attaching extraneous riders to disaster relief legislation may not be new, but as a freshman, it's the first time I've been forced and faced with such a dilemma. It's wrong. It should not be done. Some of our colleagues have said that it's the president playing politics. It's the House of Representatives playing politics, and it is not right and shouldn't be done. I agree with Grand Forks, the North Dakota Mayor Pat Owens, who said, quote, "It is not fair to play with our people's lives and put amendments onto that bill," unquote. The governor of South Dakota, Bill Janclaw, a Republican, I might add, refused to put his name on a letter to the president asking him to sign the bill. A Fargo-Moorhead Forum editorial described Janclaw's refusal as, quote, "putting the interests of flood victims ahead of partisan considerations," unquote. I appreciate that the people of this area understand why we have been forced to vote against supplying them the aid they need and deserve. A clean disaster aid bill for the victims of the flooding in the Midwest is weeks overdue. It is the right thing to do. Today, after the president's veto, there is still no clean bill. Mr. Speaker, I must ask why. People's lives are in the balance. Mr. Speaker, I must also ask why you don't allow the extraneous provisions attached to the disaster bill to stand on their own. Are you afraid they won't stand up to the scrutiny of the committee process? If these are good ideas that will benefit the American people, let them stand alone. If these extraneous provisions have a broad base of support among the American people, allow the members of this body to consider them on their own merits. Attaching them to a disaster relief bill is cowardly. I will briefly address just one of these provisions. In the 104th Congress, the House asked the Census Bureau to cut costs on the 2000 census. Follow-up analysis of the 1990 census done by the Bureau that shows that our current method is resulting in an undercount. The National Academy of Sciences has told us that a statistical technique called sampling will result in a more accurate count for the final 10% of Americans, those who don't respond to the questionnaires. The Census Bureau tells us the use of this technique will save them $1 billion in conducting the 2000 census, almost 25% of their cost. The Republicans seek to ban a technique which scientists tell us is better, and the counters tell us is cheaper. Mr. Speaker, this doesn't add up. The fact that this is attached to a disaster relief bill is a red flag waving high in the sky. It's enormously suspicious, especially when given that a few years back, Mr. Gingrich specifically requested sampling to be used in his own state. Mr. Speaker, one side of this debate has been up front with the victims of this flood, and one side has made them pawns in a political game. The Fargo-Moorhead Forum newspaper concluded on Sunday morning, and I quote again, "Republican leaders in Congress continue to play outrageous political games with the lives and futures of Red River Valley flood victims," unquote. How true and how sad it is. A clean disaster relief bill is the right thing to do. Mr. Speaker, let's get it done. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Scarborough, Florida. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman, and I've been listening to this debate on TV, decided to come over and get involved a little bit. I heard the Beatles name brought up earlier, and listening to this debate, I'm reminded of another Beatles line out of Strawberry Fields Forever. And they say, living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see. And then, of course, the hook is about how nothing is real in Strawberry Fields, where, well, nothing is real in this debate either. It reminds me so much of what happened over the past couple years, where we had Medicare come up first, and how we Republicans hated our grandmothers and senior citizens because we wanted Medicare to increase at 7.2%. But the president and the Democrats, who loved our grandparents so much more than us, wanted it to increase at 7.4%. Today, I think we voted on a bill in Ways and Means where it passed something like 30 to 3. Similar bill to what so many people were attacking before. Now it's flood victims. And it was also children. We hated children because we only wanted the school lunch program to go up 4% instead of 6 or 7%. Now we're talking about flood victims. We're talking about how we want to hurt the flood victims. Of course, as happened during the government shutdown when the president vetoed bill after bill after bill that we sent him, what people didn't recognize was that it was the president who was vetoing the bills. It was the president who vetoed this bill today. And so he, of course, he was handed a wonderful, wonderful issue. I mean, he was put on his lap. You kind of wonder how we Republicans keep sort of stepping into it and making these mistakes. But we do, because we actually think that we should debate on the merits instead of on political points. Which brings me to point two. The fact is that this crisis has been created for political purposes. What you don't hear is the fact that FEMA is funded, at least through this month. And you also saw an AP report about a month ago when this debate first started coming up before the Memorial Day break, that when the president needed an issue, what he did, because the agencies were funded through this time period, he actually pushed up, he forward-funded, according to the AP articles, requirements. So he could say, gee, these people aren't getting their money. And so he pushed the dates up for funding so he could create a political crisis. And that's what he did. And so now the president can get out and once again be compassionate and be the one that loves flood victims when Republicans supposedly hate flood victims. So let's keep a list now. It's senior citizens, it's young children, and it's flood victims. And, if I guess the Democrats believe that a sucker's born every day, I can tell you I constantly have hurricane victims in my district. I understand how this situation works, and certainly feel compassion for the people that have been suffering this crisis. Another area that, again, maybe nothing is real, or maybe as Henry Kissinger says in politics, what is it, perception's reality? We keep hearing about people saying, just give us a clean bill. Just let us fund the flood victims. That's all we really need. When in reality, if somebody would pick up the New York Times this morning and read in the New York Times that this so-called clean flood bill, where we needed $750 million to actually fund the flood victims, ended up being an $8.4 billion monstrosity. Now, I want to know, where were all these self-righteous people when these emergency parking garages were being put in this bill? When, according to the New York Times article, we threw in as, quote, an emergency funding a theater, theater renovations. And they went and they asked the guy that owned the theater, well, is this really an emergency? He said, well, we had a couple of pipes that leaked last year. The fact is that we have shoved these same people who are now screaming, give us a clean bill, were the same people, both sides, Republicans and Democrats, that were shoving as much stuff into this so-called emergency appropriations bill as they could. And yet now they come back and they whine about how they need a clean bill. Well, that didn't seem to concern them that much before. Also, we shoved in money for apple orchardists. I guess that they were so shocked and stunned by the visions that they saw on TV that they weren't able to tend to their apple orchards. Maybe that requires funding of this emergency appropriations bill. Read the New York Times article. And you'll see that these arguments about how they just want a clean bill is disingenuous. Everybody's got around the table and thrown all they could on there. Finally, why don't we talk about what this issue is really about? It's about a continuing resolution issue where we wanted to avoid letting the president do what he did before, vetoing appropriation bill after appropriation bill, and then coming out and going, I will not let the Republicans do this, that, or the other. It's just, again, it's disingenuous. This CR is the only way we ensure that we continue funding FEMA and other agencies at 100% without the president vetoing these bills time in and time out without using flood victims for political purposes. And I say, let's get to the facts of the matter and let's stop using the flood victims as political pawns. I yield back to balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Mengy of Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request permission to address the House for 5 minutes and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
I represent the 2nd District of Minnesota. It's a district that contains almost the entire length of the Minnesota River. The Minnesota River flows through a broad valley. I think for many, it's known as the Valley of the Jolly Green Giant. It's very productive, it's lush, and it's noted for the table vegetables that have been grown there over the past several decades. In the valley, there is a narrow river that winds back and forth and oxbows and normally is very placid. But occasionally it becomes a raging torrent. And in 1997, this river carried more water than it ever has since the area was settled over 100 years ago. The record water levels resulted in flooding in numerous communities, starting in Ortonville at the head of the river as it flows out of Big Stone Lake, required the evacuation of the community of Odessa. Tributaries flooded in Appleton, Dawson, Minnesota. Montevideo, Minnesota, my home community, was on the evening news for the first time in the history of the community, repeatedly, because of the efforts of the volunteers to try to stop the damage by sandbagging, building dikes. Their efforts were successful, except for one neighborhood which could not be saved and could not be diked. Downstream, Granite Falls built dikes. It was largely spared the ravages of the flood. North Redwood Falls was affected, however, and a few homes in the community known as New Ulm. Well, this was all damage that was done, but fortunately we were spared the ravages of the communities on the Red River to the north. People in my area felt quite fortunate by comparison. The communities pulled together. Thousands of volunteers came from neighboring towns, from the urban areas. And a real spirit of cooperation, goodwill prevailed. I can tell you that partisanship was certainly absent in this undertaking. The people also were impressed with the activities of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and the Army Corps of Engineers, both of which had a very substantial presence, and the National Guard troops that were mobilized and came in. I held a series of informational meetings on the disaster programs that were being established, ones that were in place. The FEMA officials, the Army Corps of Engineers, the state agencies, the U.S. Department of Agriculture agencies all came and participated in these meetings. It appeared that we would have a disaster assistance program that would both be effective in addressing the needs of the communities and the residents and would be promptly available. Unfortunately, as the days wore on, it also emerged that partisanship would be a part of the picture. In an effort to pass legislation that the leadership in this body and the other side of the building knew would be unacceptable to the president, they began to beat the drums about how important certain riders were. And unfortunately, I concluded that what was happening is that this disaster assistance bill was being hijacked for other purposes. Proposals that could not be passed being shoehorned into the disaster assistance bill in hopes that the president could be browbeaten or embarrassed into signing them. Well, we know what happened. The president vetoed the legislation. I'm not here this evening to say that we have to point fingers at the leadership in the House or the Senate or criticize the president. The fact of the matter is, all of us knew that this legislation, as it left Congress, was on a collision course with the White House. Now, it's very difficult for me to tell people at home that the political process is consumed with politics and that we cannot deliver the type of assistance that has become a consensus package for disaster assistance. It's awfully difficult for me to explain to people why it is that controversial riders have to be attached to this legislation. I can't explain it. I voted for it. I wanted to see it pass, but it was unacceptable. The previous speaker said, the money's in the pipeline. Don't worry. I'd just like to briefly point out that although FEMA is well funded, the Community Development Block Grant Program for relocation assistance is hanging in abeyance. People and businesses do not know what level of relocation assistance will be available, when it will be available. Precious construction days are slipping by. Similarly, the Livestock Indemnity Program is in limbo, and a number of other programs are simply not being addressed. I would like to urge, I implore the leadership of Congress to promptly send to the President a clean bill so that we can provide the assistance that's been long promised and is badly needed by the victims of this flooding in the upper Midwest. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Hoyer, Maryland. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to address the House and particularly to respond to the gentleman from Florida who spoke and who has since left. Mr. Scarborough made the point that Republicans, he said, were perceived as not liking children, not liking senior citizens, and now not liking flood victims. I don't know whether that's the case. Maybe that's his feeling and his concern. He also observed that both sides of the House have added things to emergency relief bills in the past and cited a New York Times article, which I have not read, but which I know to be true. That is the case. There was always the time when a bill that should pass, and most of us believe must pass and be signed, in this case, the relief for those who have been ravaged by rains and flood and who are at risk and who this nation wants to help. Everybody believes this bill ought to pass, and it ought to pass quickly. But lest my colleagues or anybody else be confused that this is the regular course of business, let me reflect a little bit on history. It took just 15 days to provide the assistance that President Bush asked this Congress to give for the victims of Hurricane Andrew. We are now in the 83rd day. Now, it wasn't that President Bush and the Congress, then led by Democrats, controlled by Democrats, agreed on everything. That was not the case. But what President Bush and the Democratic Congress did agree on was that it was our responsibility to pass that emergency relief in a timely fashion. 15 days as opposed to the 83 days that this bill has languished in this Congress. And why does this bill languish? Why does a bill that everybody said should pass and must pass not pass? It is, Mr. Speaker, because the leadership of this House and the leadership of the Senate has determined that they want to stare down the president, that they want to muscle the president, that they want to leverage the president. And they have taken hostage the victims of the floods of these past months in order to accomplish that objective. You've heard the issues discussed. There are two principal ones. One is called a continuing resolution, and is put forth by the Republicans in this House and in the Senate as an effort to prevent government shutdown. Mr. Speaker, I represent 56,000 federal employees. I'm for preventing government shutdown. In point of fact, it was in the last Congress, for the first time since I've been serving since 1981, that we consciously and purposefully shut down the government. The Republican leadership said in April of 1995 they were going to do that. They reiterated that in July of 1995, and sure enough, on November 19th, 1995, they shut down the government, looked the president in the eye, and said, if you don't do it my way, we will do it no way. That's not what the people sent us here to do. They sent us here to work together. The fact of the matter is that when we did work together, we passed appropriation bills, and we opened the government after 2 long shutdowns, consciously planned by the Republican majority to force the president to do something that he said he wasn't going to do. That never happened. When the Republicans were in control in the 80s and the first 2 years of the 90s, and Democrats controlled this Congress. Were there differences? Yes. Did the Democrats try to get the advantage on the Republican president? Yes. But did there come a time when they said that they would not move, that they would be immovable in the face of presidential opposition? And the answer is no. Now, when President Clinton asked for relief for the Midwest floods just in the last Congress, it just took us 29 days, less than 1/2 of the time that this bill has languished in this House, in the Senate. The other issue that the Republicans talk about as being a must-add to the emergency relief for flood victims is this sampling issue. It's all about politics, because Republicans have been quoted as saying, if we allow sampling and the count that will result, we will find poor people, we will find minorities, and we're afraid that they will vote for Democrats. And that will be to our political disadvantage. So the Speaker of the House, who 2 years ago said that he thought sampling made sense and ought to be pursued, has changed his position. And who suffers? The victims of the rain and the floods are held hostage as this political dispute is engaged. Mr. Speaker, a number of us have risen on this floor tonight. A number of us are rising throughout this city and talking to the press, talking to the public, and talking, yes, to our colleagues. We have a budget agreement. We sat down and for 5 months worked out a very tough problem. I supported it. That's the proper process. Not to hold hostage either government employees or flood victims or some other group and say, we will hold their relief in abeyance if you do not agree with us. Yes, Mr. Speaker, we urge the leadership of this House and of the Senate to bring to this floor tomorrow a clean, continuing resolution, relief for flood victims, support for our troops in Bosnia and around the world. Pass that. The President will sign it. We can pass it by 12 noon tomorrow. And the President will sign it by tomorrow afternoon. That is what we ought to do. Let us be about the business of giving relief to the victims of these floods.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Rothman of New Jersey. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What would you think of someone who stood by watching while a neighbor's house was burning down? What
What if that person refused to call the fire department for help unless he or she got something in return? You wouldn't think much of that person. And yet that is exactly what the Republican majority in Congress is doing with the flood victims in North Dakota as well as the victims in 35 other states. The President of the United States and many of us in Congress have been trying to pass a $5.5 billion disaster relief bill for these families. But the Republican majority, much like they did with the government shutdown last year, is putting extremist ideology and partisan political maneuvering ahead of the relief for these needy people. Instead of giving these families the needed relief that they so very much deserve, they're holding the disaster relief bill hostage by trying to attach highly partisan legislative riders that have nothing to do with disaster relief. They know that these highly partisan extremist Republican riders would never pass the Congress if voted on separately. So what did they do? In very cynical judgment, the Republican leadership decided to tack these partisan riders onto a disaster relief bill, saying in their own political calculus, well, maybe we'll embarrass the President of the United States into vetoing this, or maybe he'll be so embarrassed he won't veto it, and then we'll get these partisan goodies for us, the Republican Party. They underestimated President Clinton, who said loudly and clearly that he would not be put in a position of having the Republican majority hold these victims hostage and let them get away with it. The Republican majority would have to put forth a clean disaster relief bill, otherwise he wouldn't sign it. If they want to debate on these other partisan measures, fine. Let's debate them in the Congress. If they're right, we'll pass them. If they deserve support, we'll support them. Last week, the Senate Majority Leader is reported to have said, this is the Republican Senate Majority Leader, he's reported to have said that he would happily provide more trailers for these disaster victims to stay in while they, the Republicans, try to wear down the president to get their legislative goodies. If such reports are true and those remarks were in fact uttered, they are morally reprehensible. Such a position is unfair to these needy American families. Thousands of American citizens are homeless. They just lost all of their worldly possessions and are sleeping in shelters. They await federal disaster relief funds to finance the rebuilding of their homes and their cities. And helping each other in times of needs, isn't that the essence of what it means to be an American? To being part of the American community. If the Republicans really believe that their highly partisan political riders are worthy of support, they should remove them from the disaster relief bill and have the Congress take them up separately once the disaster bill, the clean disaster relief bill, has been passed by the House tomorrow. Then we'll take up whatever riders they want. I urge my colleagues and my friends on the other side of the aisle to tell their leadership, the leadership of the Republican Party, to stop playing politics with the lives of these thousands and thousands of disaster victims. Put forth a clean disaster relief bill. We will pass it in Congress. Our president will sign it, and let's help these people. Then we'll take up your political stuff. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The chair must remind all members that under the rules and precedents of the House, it is not in order to cast reflections on a Senate or its members individually or collectively. Speaker's announced policy of January 7th, 1997. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipsky, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I request permission to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I come to the floor tonight deeply concerned about our failed trade policies, deeply concerned about the plight of American workers, deeply concerned about the future of America. 4 years ago in this chamber, we had a long debate on NAFTA. NAFTA proponents pushed hard for its passage. They promised that NAFTA would create 200,000 American jobs. They warned that NAFTA was critical to the American economy and that American jobs depended on its passage. After 40 months under NAFTA, we can clearly see that the reality is vastly different. The reality is that NAFTA worsened our trade balance with Mexico and Canada. Since NAFTA went into effect, our $10 billion deficit with Canada turned into a larger $23 billion deficit. Our $1.7 billion surplus with Mexico slid into a $16 billion deficit. Our growing trade deficits with Mexico and Canada means that we are buying more than we are selling. It means that American jobs are being lost. The reality is that 90% of the companies that promised to create jobs haven't. Allied Signal, General Electric, Johnson & Johnson, Mattel, Procter & Gamble, Zenith, and Exxon. The list goes on and on and on. They promised NAFTA would create American jobs. In a sense, they signed a promissory note to all the working men and women of America. The note was a promise that working Americans would be better off with NAFTA. It is obvious today that these multinational corporations have defaulted on this promissory note. NAFTA is a complete and utter failure for working Americans. 4 years ago in 1993, we all heard the mantra of 200,000 jobs over and over again. Guess what? It's now 1997, and we have lost an estimated 400,000 jobs. This is a net loss. It's a staggering sum, and bear in mind that this is not just another number. There are real people behind the statistics, real people with real families and real problems. In their blind devotion to free trade, NAFTA proponents lost all contact with reality, and in so doing sacrificed 400,000 American jobs at the altar of free trade. Now, some folks want to expand NAFTA to Chile and other Latin American nations. I'm absolutely shocked. Can't they see what they have already done? It's plain to see that NAFTA has failed, yet these blind free trade advocates want to extend it to other nations. How many more American jobs do we have to lose before these people come to their senses? NAFTA is a broken trade agreement. It is an agreement that just doesn't work. If we continue to use this framework for future relationships with Chile and other Latin American countries, it will make a lousy situation even worse. The working men and women of America have suffered enough. Mr. Speaker, I am thinking today of the working men and women of America. Men and women who are proud to give a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. Men and women who work hard to put food on the table and clothes on the back of their children. Men and women who struggle to make their mortgage payments. Men and women who work longer hours for less. I am thinking today of the people who make up America. I am talking about Main Street, not Wall Street. I am talking about people who care about Medicare, Social Security, crime, and education, not leverage buyouts, not corporate takeovers, and not stock splits. I'm talking about people who put in a full day's work, attend PTA meetings, go to church, work a second job, and still see their family incomes fall, while CEOs sit in their boardrooms and watch stock quotes with the knowledge that they'll get their raises anyway. I grow tired of hearing empty promises, lofty oratory, and abstract economic theory. I want to see results. I want to see the jobs they promised us. Instead, I see the 400,000 American jobs that were lost. Instead, I see a trade surplus slide into a huge trade deficit. Instead, I see broken promises. Unfortunately for us, the bottom line is that these huge multinational corporations focus only on the accountant's bottom line. To them, American workers are an afterthought. I see a mentality where gold is God today, and that deeply concerns me. Mr. Speaker, when I graduated from high school in 1956, the world was a much different place. Thanks to the policies of FDR and the efforts of the organized labor movement, there was a burgeoning middle class in America. The New Deal especially brought a higher standard of living to American working men and women. Jobs were plentiful, workers were treated well, and people were happy and optimistic about the future. The American dream was alive and well. Nowadays, the average American worker changes jobs several times during the course of a lifetime. Jobs are scarce, and people are insecure about the future. Pessimism and cynicism rule the day. Things have really changed in the last 4 decades. Where has the American dream gone? I understand that the world has evolved. It's a world economy now, and we can't shy away from that. But we must make this world market our market. We must make it work for all Americans, not just the multinational corporations who care only about the bottom line. We must make it work for the plumber in Chicago, the fisherman in Maine, the assembly worker in Detroit, and the taxi cab driver in D.C. Let us rebuild the American dream for working men and women. Let us begin by establishing free and fair trade relationships with foreign nations and ensure they play by the same rules as we do. Rules that cover labor, environmental, and human rights issues that must be included in core trade agreements, not as an afterthought. We must treat these issues as importantly as businesses treat intellectual property rights and rule of law. We must level the playing field and get away from the gold is God mentality that some folks cling to so fervently. Let us put people before profit. What happens to the American middle class happens to America. Let us do all we can to make sure that the working men and women of this country can live out the American dream. As I mentioned earlier, there are proposals now to expand NAFTA to other countries, such as Chile. To do that, they will need Congress to grant the administration the authority to negotiate trade agreements and submit it to Congress under expedited procedures for an up or down vote. Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution vests Congress with an extremely important responsibility, and that is the responsibility to regulate commerce with foreign nations. It is our responsibility to the American people, as well as to the people of the world, to enter into fair, responsible trade agreements that respect labor, environment, and human rights. Proponents of free trade argue that placing such restrictions on trade is counterproductive. The rallying cry of laissez-faire economists may be tempting to the ignorant and the blind, but not to those who remember and history. Let us not forget the numerous social upheavals, economic crashes, and depressions that the U.S. has experienced. Let us not forget the lessons learned through those times that government regulation has played a vital and necessary role in the free market. Do we so quickly forget that it was because of government intervention that the social abuses of the late 19th and early 20th century were ended? Child labor, sweatshops, sub-starvation labor, wages, widespread pollution, and atrocious working conditions. Thanks to the government and labor unions, we were able to stamp these abuses out. Some folks have been misled into thinking that government regulations must be bad. History is supposed to provide us with valuable lessons. How quickly some forget. Mr. Speaker, NAFTA is a failure. It failed because it put profits before people, multinational corporations before families. It failed because NAFTA does not adequately address industrial relations, the right to strike, the right to organize, and the right to freely associate. It's clear that Mexican workers do not enjoy the same level of labor rights as we do here in America. To make a bad situation worse, their wages are essentially capped under an agreement known as El Pacto, and a large number of owners also privately set minimum and maximum wages so that they don't compete for workers on this basis. All of these factors combine to create a downward pressure on wages in Mexico. Since NAFTA began, the wages and living conditions of Mexican workers have not improved. In fact, the exact opposite has occurred. They've declined. The percentage of Mexicans considered extremely poor rose from 31% in 1993 to 50% in 1996. Real manufacturing wages have declined 25% since NAFTA went into effect. Environmental conditions have deteriorated. Instead of moving into the 21st century, they're sliding back to the dark ages. The unfortunate end result of all this is that Mexican workers are viewed simply as a source of cheap labor by multinational corporations, which creates a serious problem for us in America. With a large pool of cheap labor a short distance away, multinational corporations have a great deal of freedom and incentive to move manufacturing facilities to Mexico. And fewer environmental regulations there means even more money saved. Moving production to Mexico results in lower overhead, which means higher profits for corporations. Here's a case in point. During the NAFTA debate in 1993, Zenith Electronics Corporation denied that a report that they would transfer all of their production facilities to Mexico as a result of NAFTA. On the contrary, Zenith said, NAFTA offers the prospect of more jobs at the company's Melrose Park, Illinois facility. Nevertheless, to say, Zenith announced late last year that it was laying off 800 of its 3,000 workers at the Melrose Park facility. Not only are companies moving their facilities to Mexico, leaving hundreds of thousands of hard-working Americans in their wake, it is now commonplace for them to use it as a threat. They use it as a scare tactic in order to undermine the efforts of workers to improve their wages, benefits, and working conditions through collective bargaining. A recent Cornell University study found that a significant number of companies threatened to move work to Mexico as part of their efforts to intimidate workers who want to unionize. I find it morally reprehensible to resort to such tactics. It undermines the legal right of American workers who want to form unions. It undermines the basic right of American workers who want to provide a better living for themselves and their families. Proponents of NAFTA touted it as a win-win-win situation. It sure has been a win-win-win situation. It's a win for big business in Mexico. It's a win for big business in America. It's a win for big business in Canada. It's the working families who lose. Mr. Speaker, this is an important and complex issue. As the world economy becomes increasingly interwoven and trade continues to grow as an important part of our national economy, we must ensure that we enter into trade agreements that are fair and equitable to the American worker. We must evaluate trade relationships from this perspective. As such, we have got to take a long, hard look at NAFTA and what it has done to the working men and women of America. We must think about granting fast-track authority to the administration and what it will mean for the American middle class. We should closely examine the arguments for the expansion of NAFTA to Chile and other Latin American nations. As David Bonner noted, there are more people in this Congress who voted against NAFTA 4 years ago than voted for it. And many of those who voted for it say they would never vote for it again. The evidence against NAFTA is growing, and it is becoming just too hard for folks to ignore. Mr. Speaker, I would now like to recognize the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Sanders, who is going to engage me in a colloquy about NAFTA, trade, and numerous other issues that affect the American working man and woman. Mr. Sanders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lipinski, and I applaud your remarks, and I especially congratulate you for focusing your thoughts on what's happening to ordinary working people rather than just the very wealthy and the very powerful. One of the aspects of modern life which concerns me very much is that when we turn on the television or we read the newspapers, as you well know, we hear about the booming economy, don't we? We hear about how some Wall Street folks tell us that the economy literally has never been better in our lifetimes, and they wonder just how long it continue to be so good. And then I go back to the state of Vermont, and I talk to working people from one end of the state to the other, and I say to them, tell me about the booming economy. And what they say is, Bernie, I'm working 2 jobs or 3 jobs, and my wife is out working long hours just to pay the bills, so we don't have too much time to consider the booming economy. We're just working hard to keep our heads above water. And the reality is, according to the official statistics, that in the midst of all of this great boom, what's going on for the average working person? We don't hear that too much. Yeah, we know recently, we read recently, that the CEOs of major corporations are now earning over 200 times what their workers are making. So we concede. For the CEOs, the chief executive officers of major corporations, things are booming. That's true. And we also read recently that compensation for the CEOs last year was 54% higher than the previous year. We can see that too. If you're a CEO of a major corporation, I guess the economy is booming. But when you read through the fine print, you find that for the average American worker last year, wages went up on average by about 3.8%. Inflation is about 3%. And we know that low-wage workers got a bit of a boost because we raised the minimum wage a little bit. We know that the higher-income workers generally do better than the middle-class workers. So you add it all together, and what you discover is that in the midst of this great boom, the standard of living of the average middle-class worker continues to decline. And if the standard of the standard of living of working-class people declines today in the midst of the boom, I wonder very much what will happen when our boom ends, as it is sure to end. I am also concerned that in the midst of all of this so-called boom, the United States continues to have, by far, not even close, the most unfair distribution of wealth and income in the industrialized world. And we don't talk about that too much. We don't see this too much on the corporate media's television stations or in the newspapers. But the facts are pretty clear. The wealthiest 1% of the population now owns over 40% of the wealth of America. And the richest 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. And we have the greatest gap between the rich and the poor of any other country in the industrialized world. What kind of boom is that? We know that during the last 20 years, while we have seen a significant increase in millionaires and billionaires, 80% of all American families have seen either a decline in their net income or at best economic stagnation. In fact, adjusted for inflation, the average pay of 4/5 of American workers plummeted 16% in 20 years. 20 years ago in the United States of America, as you well know, Mr. Lipinski, the United States led the world in terms of the wages and benefits we provided our workers. We were number one, and now, in the midst of the great boom, we are down to 13th place. In Germany, for example, manufacturing workers there earn over 25% what manufacturing workers in the United States earn. In 1973, the average American worker earned $445 a week. 20 years later, with inflation-adjusted dollars, that same worker was making $373 a week. People today are working far longer hours than they have to, than they were 20 years ago. So you're seeing people working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, overtime, women who would prefer to be home with the kids being forced to work in order to pay the bills. Where is the boom for the middle class or the working class of this country? It's not there. And one of the reasons, as you so aptly pointed out in your remarks, is the disastrous and failing trade policy which this country is currently experiencing. And in my opinion, it is not just NAFTA, it's GATT, it's most favored nation status with China, it is the huge trade deficit that we have. And as I think you indicated, the issue is not too complicated. If an American company is forced to choose between paying an American worker a living wage of $10 or $15 an hour, providing decent benefits, having to protect the environment, or run to Mexico where you can get a good worker there for 70 or 80 cents an hour, you don't have to worry about the environment, you don't have to worry about unions, what choice is that employer going to make? And the evidence is pretty clear, the choice that that employer has made, which is why we have lost hundreds of thousands of jobs. So I would just say as we begin our discussion here, I know in my state of Vermont, and I expect throughout the country, there may be a boom, but it certainly is not applying to the middle class or the working families of my state, and I would yield back.
Bernie, I appreciate your remarks, and I want to say that we don't necessarily agree with everything that this man had to say, but for me, one of the highlights of the last presidential election was when Pat Buchanan was running, and he was running on the issue of insecurity, the economic insecurity of the American middle class, the American working class. He spoke about it a great deal. He articulated it very well. And he forced President Clinton and Senator Dole to talk about it also. And I think it got wide dissemination. A lot of the media picked up on it. Unfortunately, when he went out of the race, President Clinton stopped talking about it. Senator Dole stopped talking about it. And the issue has just drifted away. And I say to you, I don't understand why the issue drifted away. It is the most significant, important issue facing this nation today. I said that when international communism ceased to exist, the Cold War was over, and we were in an economic war. And by that I meant a war to improve the standard of living of the American working and middle class. And to me, I believe we are losing that war. We are losing it more each and every day, each and every week, each and every month. And no one in this nation other than a very few voices, seem to have anything to say about it. What is your opinion on that?
I think you raise a very, very important point, and I'll tell you that the theme that you're talking about suggests to me very frightening and dangerous times, and this is why. The average worker reads in the paper that the economy is booming, right? That things are going well. And he says to himself or to herself, what is the matter with me? Everybody must be doing well except me. My wages have gone down. I don't have health care. I can't. Everybody must be doing well except me. My wages have gone down. I don't have health care. I can't afford to send my kids to college. I'm working longer hours. And I don't see it on. It must be me, right? I must be the only person in America who is suffering economically. You indicate, of course, it is the majority of the people who are hurting. Now, you raise the question, why isn't it? Well, let me offer you a suggestion on another issue, equally important, that we also don't discuss. Where do we get our information from, Mr. Lipinski?
From the news media?
Yeah, we turn on the television. Let's just look at that for a moment. Who owns NBC? Well, General Electric Corporation, one of the large corporations in America. You mentioned, among others.
Yes, I did.
The General Electric is one of the companies who is busy running to Mexico. I think they're investing in China. They have laid off significant numbers of workers. They come before this body every day trying to figure out a way they don't have to pay taxes, leading the efforts against organized. Well, great shock of all shocks. NBC does not have a feature on the class. They don't talk about it too much. O.J. Simpson, we can get thousands of hours. Every airplane crash that ever, we could see the great visuals. But the fact that the average American worker has seen a decline in their standard of living, are struggling just to keep their heads above water, somehow that story, gee, they just didn't get it. Well, what about ABC? We flick the dial, and maybe ABC will give us the story. But ABC, why? That's the Disney company. Disney company is busy running to China. They're in Haiti. They're paying people in those countries pennies an hour to produce products that come back into America. I don't recall seeing too many features on their about the trade or about the exploitation of Haitian or Chinese workers. I don't recall that. Maybe we'll go to CBS. We'll get a better story. Well, I guess not. That station is owned by Westinghouse. Or maybe we'll go to the Fox network, which is owned by that strong, progressive Rupert Murdoch, worth many billions of dollars. Now, I don't think we'll see it there either. So I would argue that one of the reasons that the American people are not seeing the pain of their lives being reflected in the media is that the media is large multinational corporations, many of whom jobs to Mexico and China, and the media would rather obfuscate, perhaps, rather give us entertainment and game shows and soap operas rather than discuss with the American people the important issues. And that would be one reflection I would have.
Well, that certainly is a very reflection. I'll have to take that under consideration, and I will certainly do that, and perhaps I will come to the same conclusion that you have come to. But I want to say that I admire the fact that you and Dave Bonyard and Pete, my buddy from Oregon, DeFazio, excuse me, and Marcy Kaptur and Major Owens and a number of other people come down on Tuesday night and try to get this message out to the American people. And I think it's a wonderful effort, and I applaud you for it. I am happy to participate with you tonight. But I have to say to you in all candor, we need to get a much bigger microphone. We have to have these conversations amplified significantly, I believe, in order to have any real on this nation. And I believe that we have to find ourselves a presidential candidate who is willing to articulate the about economic insecurity in this nation. Because I don't think there's any other way we can once again this issue back to the front burner, make American people aware of the fact that we know what their problems are. There are some people willing to jump into this battle and try to aid and assist them. But I think the only way we get them motivated, mobilized, by having someone run for president in this nation who is going to articulate that issue. What do you think of that?
I think that would be of enormous importance, and I think, Bill, as you know, I'm independent. And
Yes.
I'm not a Democrat, and I'm not a
And
Republican.
I'm not asking to support anyone
Right.
here tonight.
And one of the reasons that I'm an independent is that I feel that to a large degree both political parties are dominated by big money interest, and it would be very hard for that candidate who's prepared to stand up to large multinational corporations who have so much influence over our economy and over the politics of what goes on here. It is no great secret. I mean, as you well know, we hear a whole lot of discussion about the influence of big labor in the political process. You're aware that corporate America has 7 times more money than it does.
Absolutely.
And when we talk about most FM China, that there's a massive lobbying effort going on by corporate America trying to influence the members of this party. They will put ads on newspapers throughout this country telling everybody how good these trade policies are. Whether or not the two-party system can give birth to a candidate who is prepared to take on these moneyed interests, I frankly have my doubts. But one of the things that does concern me is that what does go on here in this body is, instead of addressing the issue of the fact that in ways this nation is becoming an oligarchy dominated relatively few large corporations and wealthy individuals, it's recognizing that reality and trying and develop policies which address that problem. What we see is a lot of scapegoating. What we see is black against white, native versus immigrant, gay versus straight, everybody against everybody, rather than figuring out how we can come together as to try to address the difficult problems that you about the global economy. Can we create, with all of this new technology, every day we hear about the information highway, right? How important the computers are. Well, if all of it is so valuable as I expect that it is, why aren't we seeing increased wealth going to the middle class and the working class? Why aren't we seeing people working fewer hours rather than longer hours? Why aren't we seeing more people covered by health insurance than fewer? Why do we have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world? Why are we in the process right now, as some would have us, cutting Medicare by $115 billion, lowering the quality of health care for our senior citizens? So the issue becomes, how do we come together as a people, black and white, immigrant and native born, woman and man, gay and straight, all of us together to say, how do we create jobs for our people rather than seeing our jobs go to China, where are being paid 20 cents an hour? How do we use technology to lower the work week rather than to put Americans out of their jobs? And we're not doing that. We're not addressing that. And I think the reason is that the beginning with some of the answers to those questions is to challenge big money interests, and to a large, in my feeling, is in this body, it's almost an issue people feel uncomfortable about talking about. We're just not allowed to talk about the power of the wealthy.
That seems to be the case. A lot of people are very uncomfortable about talking about it. Now, I'm a capitalist. I believe in the free system. But I also believe that an economy should be run for the benefit of the overwhelming majority of the members of that society. It really should be the principle that guides us in all the legislation we put forth here and in the other body, in legislation that the president signs into law. Do what is best for the overwhelming majority of the American citizens, economically and in every other way. And it may sound sick, and perhaps it really is, but that's the way the country should be done. That's the way the legislation should come forward. And unfortunately, the longer I'm here, the less and less I believe. So, Bernie, I'd like you to conclude. If you have any concluding remarks. I'm finished for the evening. Hope to be back next Tuesday. But, Bernie, do you have anything to say in conclusion?
Well, I would just agree with you that clearly the task of the Congress is to represent the vast majority of the people and not just the very few who are wealthy and powerful. But I think, Bill, as you would agree, that is very often not the case. And let me point out one example of that in terms of tax policy. And in fact, debating that right now in terms of the budget that was recently proposed by Mr. Archer, which would give huge tax breaks to the wealthy, while at the same time we cut back Medicare, certain Medicaid programs, and, by the way, on veterans programs. In terms of tax policy, what's gone on in the country, people should know that from 1977 to 1990, the Social Security tax was raised 9 times. And today, people are, if you're self-employed, you're paying 15% before you pay any income tax, FICA tax. During that same period, while taxes on working people through the FICA tax went way up, taxes for the wealthy and the large corporations went way down, and the federal ended up collecting significantly less money, which helped cause us the deficit problem that we're trying to address right now. I conclude, Bill, by saying that you're right in suggesting what I think the vast majority of the people would agree with in notice, and that is the function of this institution is to represent the overwhelming majority of our people who are not wealthy, who work hard, who are struggling to keep their heads above water. And unfortunately, that is not the case now. The people who have the money have enormous power and enormous influence over this institution. And what I would hope is that in the towns and cities all over this country, people must begin to get in the political process, study the issues. What is our trade policy? Is it working? Is it not working? Why is it that we have such an unfair distribution of wealth? About our tax system, does it favor corporations and the wealthy or the middle class and working families? And I would hope that people begin to study the issues, get involved in the issues, and play a much more active role in the political process, because God only knows we certainly need their strength and their energy in order to influence what's on here. And Bill, I thank you very much for allowing me to...
Bertie, I appreciate you joining me today, and Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.